In this lesson, we'll introduce CSS to add some flair and design to our website. We've added tons of content to our web pages and learned how to organize our website with a simple structure. At this point, we've learned a lot about using HTML to add content to our website. On the flip side, we'll be using CSS in order to make our websites look more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. So you're wondering, what is CSS? What exactly is it? Well, it stands for Cascading Style Sheet. It's long and complex to say, so we often call it CSS for short. Just like HTML encompasses many different things to add content to our website, CSS encompasses many things to design our website to make it look more beautiful. It's a language used to describe the presentation of markup language. HTML is a markup language since it marks up our text, adds functionality, and helps the computer understand what to do with the text. Kind of like your teacher marking up your homework with a red pen. It doesn't change your answer and what you wrote, but the additional markups help you understand what you got right or wrong. Maybe your teacher marked up a little comment to tell you that you did a good job, paying homage to our previous lesson dealing with commenting our code. CSS is slightly different from just marking up your text. It's a whole systematic way of changing the look of your website. It's so big that it requires its own separate section for the computer to understand what to do with it. But the cool thing about CSS is that it allows us to make our website look a whole lot better and consistent. Some of you might be wondering why you should learn CSS when you can just add content to your website and be done with it. Well, if we imagine a world without CSS, the internet would be a very dull place. Websites would look boring and not very interactive. CSS allows programmers to modify the design and look of a website. It allows for limitless creativity, and it makes it a whole lot easier when it comes to designing a website. Enough talking about what CSS is, and let's dive into how we actually use CSS. There's three fundamental ways to add CSS to our website: inline styling, internal style sheet, and external style sheet. Inline styling is a method you're familiar with. We did this in a previous lesson on font styling. It's directly placing code into an HTML element within the body section of the web page. Remember adding the style attribute to a paragraph tag and changing the text color to red? Yes, that's inline styling using CSS. Internal style sheet is when we place our CSS code directly in the head section of our HTML web page. Remember the head and body section in our HTML web page? With an internal style sheet, the body contains the content and the head section contains CSS code. It separates our code for content and code for design into their own sections. External style sheets take it a step further. Instead of putting our CSS code directly into the head section of our HTML web page, we place our CSS code entirely in a separate computer file, so the computer can use this file to easily design multiple HTML web pages. Using it this way, we can make our web page follow a theme that is consistent throughout when the user browses our website. This method is the most commonly used practice on the internet. Let's dive deeper into the pros and cons of using each method. If you remember doing the font styles lesson, you remember the inline styling method pretty well. Inline styling is simply adding the style attribute to an HTML element that we want to change the look for. The style attribute can actually contain any CSS property. Inline styling is used to apply a unique style for one specific element. In this example below, we have two H2 elements, but we only change one to the color red. Even though we've been using inline styling in our previous lessons, inline styling is actually used quite rarely. It has limited scope and can only change one HTML element at a time, so it's generally discouraged. It's the most straightforward method, but from here on out, we shouldn't use it. When we dive deeper into internal and external styling sheets, you'll understand why. Also, on a side note, inline styling should be carefully used, because it'll override all other methods of styling, which means that if you use an internal or external styling sheet, which we will discuss in just a bit, inline styling will force the computer to do what it wants it to do. So if you were to work on your internal or external styling sheets, and you don't see the computer doing what you're telling it to do, it's quite possible that an inline style is forcing the computer to do something else. When working with a single web page, web developers have the option of using an internal styling sheet. This method of styling separates our design and our content within the head and body section of our web page. which means anything that refers to the design of the page goes within the head of the web page, and anything that refers to the content goes in the body. To add CSS code using this method, we simply add a style container tag inside the head section. Again, to reinforce the notion of a container tag, this means we open up our style tag with an opening tag and close it with a closing tag that includes the /. Notice in this example below that all the CSS declarations go in the style section we just made, meaning if we declare h2 to be the color red, all the elements that are h2 will be red. Knowing this, we now know we can easily change multiple elements at the same time with a single snippet of code. Using an internal style sheet is a lot better than using inline styling. With this method, we can change multiple HTML elements at the same time with a small snippet of code. Oftentimes, you have the option of using this method when you're working with a single unique web page. The most important method out of the three is external style sheets. This method requires us to create a new computer file called a .css file that contains all our CSS code in a separate area which multiple HTML web pages can have access to. In order to do this, we can simply create a new .css file. Then, inside our HTML file, we want to style using CSS, type the link tag inside the head section, and load the CSS file using the href attribute. You can see how this is done in the example below. On the left is a newly created .css file called style.css, and on the right is the style.css file being loaded into our HTML file called index.html. External style sheets enable us to style multiple web pages at once. It keeps our web pages looking consistent with the same styling. Once we create a theme or design we like with our CSS file, all we need to do with each HTML file is load the CSS file with the link tag in order to apply our theme or design. CSS styles declared with this method affects all matching elements on all web pages linked with our CSS file. For example, if we declared in our CSS file that h2 should be the color red, any HTML web page linked to the CSS file will have its h2 element styled as the color red. This saves us a lot of time and work, especially when we're working with hundreds of web pages. Here's an example of 3 web pages using an external style sheet. Notice at the very top is the style.css file. Inside this file, we declare that h2 should be the color red. Now below that is 3 HTML files called page 1, page 2, and page 3. Imagine that each one of these files contain an h2 element containing whatever text we want inside the body section. Now notice the code inside the head section. We linked style.css for each one of them. When we do this, page 1, page 2, and page 3 should all have their h2 elements with text changed to the color red. Now to review between internal and external styling sheets, we should understand when we should use them. We work with internal styling sheets when we're working with small websites with just 1 or 2 web pages. Internal styling sheets are useful when we want to make every page of the website look unique and different. We often use external styling sheets for multi-page websites. External styling sheets set a theme for our web pages so it has a uniform look and feel to all the web pages. External styling sheets are the most powerful form of CSS styling as it lets designers make site-wide changes easily and quickly. So now we understand the 3 methods of applying CSS to our web pages. Let's look at how CSS code is written. There's a specific syntax we need to write CSS in, and it's slightly different from writing in HTML. In CSS, we choose elements to stylize by choosing what we call selectors. A selector is a fancy name to refer to the HTML element we want to stylize. A paragraph tag, a class, or an ID are all examples of selectors. For each selector, we can choose how we want to stylize the element using properties and values. Properties are different ways we can style our elements. Some properties can include the color of a font, the typeface, and text alignment. There's countless types of properties, so we won't dive deep into naming them. Take a look at the example below and notice where the selector, property, and value is in the pseudocode. This is the basic structure of a CSS declaration. Now, diving deeper into the syntax of selectors, there are different ways to refer to different types of selectors. In the generic example, this is the pseudocode that we should think of when it comes to the basic structure of a CSS declaration. Pseudocode isn't actually code that works or is tied to a particular language syntax. It's used to simply tell us the basic structure of something. Here, it's telling us how the structure of a CSS declaration is with the selector, property, and value. Moving on to the element example, this is a concrete example of CSS being used on a paragraph tag element. When referring to anything else other than an HTML element such as IDs, you can see that the ID selector example, you can refer to an ID by placing the hashtag in front. If you want to refer to a class selector, you can see in the class selector example that placing a period in front, it'll refer to a class. Now that you have a grasp with selectors, we'll move on to setting properties for these selectors. Each selector can have multiple properties. You can define as many properties as you want for a selector. Notice that when you do so, you have to place a semicolon after each property you're declaring. In this example, you can see the paragraph tag is being changed to the color red, semicolon, changed to the font style italics, semicolon, and the text will be aligned to the center, semicolon. All of these declarations are wrapped nicely within two curly braces. Here are several common CSS properties we can use to format text. You can note these down for later use. Many web programmers use these often enough that they eventually memorize them. You can too. Beyond just formatting your text with the properties stated in the last slide, you can customize your website with many different colors. There's over 100 different named colors that you can choose from. You can see all of these colors by going to the world's largest web developer website resource at w3schools.com. For further learning, please head over to the assignment section on Replit. It'll give you a great practice activity and further instruction on how CSS styles work.